creeping through the haze, shadows dance in twisted ways, echoes hum from worlds unseen. This is where the strange convene. Step into the unknown mind, secrets hidden, twist and bind, truths that linger in between. Welcome to the spectral stream.
This whole idea of what happens afterward, it's a huge mystery, isn't it? When we're like, well, done, that little spark of you. Does it just disappear? Or could there be a way to connect somehow? It seems like humanity has always been a bit obsessed with figuring that one out.
It definitely gets at something pretty fundamental, doesn't it? The whole question of what consciousness is. Whether there might be something beyond what we can perceive right now. It fuels spiritual beliefs and scientific curiosity, that's for sure.
Which is a perfect lead-in to what we're doing today. We are diving deep, and I mean deep, into a really fascinating historical document called Studies in Spiritism. Forget all those ghost hunting shows you see now. This is the real deal. A super serious investigation from way back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were looking into all the stuff surrounding Spiritism, and especially this one medium, Mrs. Piper. And here's the kicker. This book came straight from you, one of our listeners. So it's clear that there's a lot of interest in exploring this kind of controversial piece of history.
Absolutely. This was a time when what they called psychical research was really taking off. You had real scientists, serious thinkers, actually trying to use rigorous methods to try and get a handle on these things. It seemed totally unexplainable. And Studies in Spiritism gives us such a great detailed look at what those early investigations were like.
All right, so our mission today is to pull out the most interesting and important observations from this book. We'll focus on the main person, the famous medium Mrs. Piper, and see what her case can tell us about mediumship itself, but also those bigger questions about telepathy. And maybe even get into what makes us, well, us, the whole thing about personality. Okay, let's get right into it. So how did Mrs. Piper first end up on the radar of these researchers?
The book goes into how she came to be known, and the early investigations were done by some pretty big names. People like Dr. Richard Hodgson and even William James, the super famous psychologist, was involved. But from the very beginning, the main question was Mrs. Piper the real deal? Or was this all some kind of trickery?
Yeah, you can imagine the level of scrutiny she must have been under. So what did they do first to try and understand what was happening?
They were very careful to observe her trance states. The book describes how she'd go into these trances, often with physical things happening like her head dropping, changes in her breathing, even her pulse rate would change. And these trances could last a while. It's interesting that early on, they did some physical tests, like checking if she was moving things under the table or something. But the results were all over the place. Sometimes it seemed totally normal, other times not at all.
Contradictory right from the start. That's already a bit of a puzzle. So once she was in one of these trances, who or what was supposed to be doing the talking?
That's where this idea of controls comes in. They were supposed to be spirits who communicated through Mrs. Piper. The book mentions a bunch of them. In the beginning, there was this one called Finuit. He was described as a French doctor. Then later, other figures showed up. One was George Pelham, who was actually someone some of the researchers knew personally when he was alive. There was even a group called Moses and the Imperator group. And then, really important later on, there was the Hodgson control, supposedly the spirit of Dr. Hodgson himself after he passed away.
So each of these controls had their own distinct, personalities, I guess.
That's the impression you get from the book. Each one was given different characteristics, and the book even says that these controls seem to, kind of evolve over time. But there's something really important the book brings up. The people themselves, the sitters, might have been affecting what was being said. Their expectations, even little unintentional cues, could have had a role in shaping the messages.
Oh, yeah, I can totally see that. If you really want to hear from a certain person, you might kind of accidentally steer the conversation that way, or interpret something vague so it fits what you're hoping for.
Exactly. And this led to them trying something called test messages. The idea was to try and get verifiable information, stuff that Mrs. Piper or her controls couldn't possibly have known any other way. Think sealed envelopes with questions written inside, kept secret the whole time.
Wow, like the ultimate test of psychic ability. So did they end up getting any clear, undeniable answers?
The findings were, well, let's just say they were complicated, often pretty open to interpretation. The book goes into the nature of these messages. They were often choppy, sometimes made absolutely no sense, and a lot of times needed serious interpretation to even understand them. Proving that it was really a dead person communicating, that was super hard. There were gaps in the records of the session. Sometimes the writing was just gibberish. And sometimes it seemed like the control was just throwing out random stuff to see if the person would give more specific details. They called this phishing. So yeah, not exactly like getting a crystal clear phone call from beyond the grave.
Definitely not a smoking gun then. I know Studies in Spiritism also talks about the reactions of the people who had sessions with Mrs. Piper. It wasn't like everyone was convinced it was real spirit communication, right?
Yeah, not at all. The book does a really good job of presenting all the different opinions. It groups them into 3 categories: favorable, intermediate, and unfavorable. On the favorable side, you had some big names: Oliver Lodge, Frederick Myers, Richard Hodgson, at least in the beginning, and then again later, supposedly as the control, and James Hyslop. Plus, lots of regular attendees who were pretty much convinced that the whole thing was genuine.
What about the folks in the middle ground?
The intermediate group, as the book calls it, included people like Eleanor Sidgwick and her husband Henry, Alice Johnson, and even William James. He was really intrigued by what he saw, but he stayed cautious and never fully committed to the idea that it was spirits. They all acknowledged that there were strange things going on, but they weren't ready to rule out other explanations.
And then there were the skeptics, right? Those who just flat out didn't buy it.
Right. The unfavorable opinions came from a range of scientists and researchers. G.H. Darwin, who was Charles Darwin's son, was one. He was super skeptical because there wasn't any solid evidence that could be replicated. Plus, he was always concerned about the potential for fraud, which made sense given his scientific background. There was Weir Mitchell, and even Richard Hodgson later in his investigations. Frank Podmore and G. Stanley Hall, too. They were often skeptical because there wasn't that hard scientific proof, and it seemed like there could be other, more plausible explanations.
So basically a whole spectrum of beliefs based on actual firsthand experience. Okay, I want to talk about something the book calls cross-correspondences. It sounds super complicated. What were those exactly?
This part of the research is really fascinating, and yeah, it gets pretty complicated. It involved multiple mediums, all working independently in different places. The book mainly focuses on Mrs. Piper, Mrs. Holland in India, and Mrs. Verrall in England. The basic idea was that spirits would supposedly communicate these fragmented messages through different mediums, and you could only understand the whole meaning by putting all the pieces from each medium together. Some people thought this was strong evidence against things like fraud or even telepathy from one living person. So think about this. Even crazy coincidences that seem impossible, may be happening across different minds and locations, don't automatically mean it's got to be spirits. It shows how incredibly powerful the subconscious mind can be, and how there might be subtle, hidden connections between people that we don't even realize.
It's like some kind of ghostly long-distance game of telephone, and everyone only gets a tiny part of the message. Can you give us an example of how this supposedly worked in practice?
The book has several examples. One is this weird name, Viramjay. It showed up in Mrs. Holland's automatic writing, and it seemed connected to a sealed envelope test they were doing with Mrs. Verrall in England. Another example was these recurring mentions of specific things, like lilies in a cup. They kept popping up in the writing of different mediums. There were even times when literary references, like things from Shakespeare's Macbeth and poetry by Tennyson, would appear in a coordinated way. But one of the cases they really analyzed deeply was this Greek phrase that popped up, or JC skepto. It means the very heaven waveless. This phrase is connected to the philosopher Plotinus and the work of Frederick Myers, and it appeared through Mrs. Verrall and also through the supposed Myers control communicating through Mrs. Piper.
Wow, yeah, that definitely sounds like something that would be really hard to explain away as just chance. But I'm guessing, like with everything else, the book also presents some alternative, less supernatural explanations for these connections, right?
You bet. For every one of these cross-correspondences that seemed impossible to explain, the book very carefully explores possible natural explanations. One possibility is subconscious suggestion. Maybe one medium, without even realizing it, picks up on the thoughts or interests of a sitter who also happens to be connected to another medium. Then there's prior knowledge. Could Mrs. Piper or the other mediums have come across these names objects or literary references before and just forgotten about it. Coincidence, as unlikely as it might seem, is another thing they had to consider, especially since they were dealing with a huge amount of automatic writing. The book even goes into great detail about the Guidance Chusmon case. They explore the possibility that Mrs. Piper might have encountered those Greek words and the philosophical ideas before, maybe through her work with Professor Newbold, who helped her translate Greek texts.
So even these really intricate, interconnected messages could actually have pretty ordinary origins. Now, I want to shift gears a little and talk about something the book brings up called the theory of secondary personality. They suggest it might explain Mrs. Piper's abilities. For our listeners who haven't heard that term before, can you break down what it means in this context?
Of course. What they called secondary personality back then is basically what we now understand as dissociative identity disorder. The idea is that under certain psychological pressures, a person can develop different personality states that are distinct and pretty long-lasting. The book looks at the similarities between Mrs. Piper's trance states and what's often seen in cases of dissociative identity disorder.
What kind of similarities did the researchers observe?
They noticed several things, like it seemed like Mrs. Piper could enter a trance state voluntarily. They saw that the characteristics of her different controls were kind of influenced by the suggestions and expectations of the people there during the sessions. And she also claimed to have amnesia, meaning she couldn't remember what went on during the trances. The book even mentions that G. Stanley Hall, based on his direct observations of Mrs. Piper, concluded that everything she did could be explained by secondary personality.
But hold on, didn't the sheer number of different controls she had, like French doctors, dead researchers, all sorts of different personalities, didn't that seem to argue against the secondary personality idea? It seems like a lot for one person's mind to come up with.
You're totally right. That was a major objection back then. But the book offers a counter-argument. It says that maybe the reason Mrs. Piper had such a wide range of controls was because of the special supportive environment she was in, especially compared to more typical cases of what we now call dissociative identity disorder. In many of those cases, when a new personality emerges, it causes distress and people try to suppress it. But Mrs. Piper was surrounded by people who accepted and even encouraged these different controls. So the argument is that this nurturing environment allowed a much wider, more diverse range of personality states to develop.
That is super interesting. It totally turns the usual understanding upside down.
Right.
Okay, so if it wasn't spirits, and maybe it was secondary personality, what other explanations did they seriously consider? The book's title mentions Spiritism, but it also mentions telepathy, right?
Yep. Telepathy, or what they called thought transference back then, was another big focus of their investigation. The idea was that maybe Mrs. Piper was tapping into the thoughts of the sitters or other people, whether she realized it or not. The book talks about some early experiments by researchers like Richet. They were trying to prove that thought transference existed, but the book points out that these early studies had some serious flaws. For instance, she might have had something called hyperesthesia. Basically, that means she was super sensitive to sensory input, so maybe she was picking up on really subtle cues that other people missed.
So maybe not mind reading in the classic sense, but possibly just incredibly tuned into tiny bits of body language or unconscious signals.
That's definitely one of the possibilities they looked into. The book also mentions this huge project by the Society for Psychical Research. They did a massive survey on hallucinations. It included tons of reports of what they called veridical death apparitions and ghosts. These were experiences where people thought they saw someone who had recently died, and their appearance seemed to match up with the time of death. They collected loads of these stories, but they were very clear that it was really tough to find truly solid cases. Cases where you could completely rule out things like memory mistakes, suggestion, or just plain coincidence. They also talk about the research of Vichy, who suggested that these telepathic hallucinations often happen between people who were really close emotionally and shared a similar mental environment. And actually, when they analyzed the cases from the book Phantasms of the Living, they found that a huge percentage of these reported events happened between family members or close friends.
Which again makes you think that maybe it's more about the power of connection, some kind of unconscious communication between living minds rather than actual contact with the dead. Now, I know Studies in Spiritism also has detailed accounts of actual sessions with Mrs. Piper, right? Were there any specific things from those sessions that really stood out?
Oh, for sure. The book has detailed records of sessions attended by people like G. Stanley Hall and others. They were often trying to test the supposed identity of the Hodgson control, see how it reacted to different questions and stimuli. For example, they documented times when Mrs. Piper, as she was coming out of her trance, would say or do things that seemed kind of subliminal. It suggested there might be some overlap or blurring between her conscious self and those trance personalities.
And were there any moments where something seemed particularly revealing or even contradictory?
There were definitely times when the control seemed to contradict itself, or it would show gaps in its knowledge that made it seem like it wasn't a genuinely separate, independent being. The book also talks about attempts to use word association tests, similar to the Jung-Floyd tests, with both Mrs. Piper in her normal state and the Hodgson control. And what's interesting is that they found similarities in their emotional reactions to certain categories of words like sex and operations. This hints that maybe it was all coming from the same underlying psychology, not two completely different entities. On top of that, the control often seemed weirdly eager to agree with made-up information and didn't really resist leading suggestions. Again, this lends support to the ideas of secondary personality or the strong influence of suggestion.
So after digging through all these investigations and interpretations and studies in Spiritism, what's the big takeaway? What does it all mean for us, sitting here today?
What the book really shows is just how incredibly complicated all the stuff surrounding Mrs. Piper is. It lays out all the main explanations they considered back then. Real communication with spirits, secondary personality, telepathy or thought transference, suggestion, and even the possibility of coincidence, no matter how crazy some of the coincidences seemed. And the key point is, there isn't any solid proof for any single explanation. It's super hard to investigate these kinds of elusive, subjective phenomena in a way that's truly scientific.
So no easy answers wrapped up in a neat little paranormal package. Sounds like we're left with more questions than conclusions.
Exactly. And that brings us to something for you to think about, dear listener. Given all these detailed investigations and the huge range of interpretations, what does this tell us about the nature of belief itself? About how powerful suggestion can be, whether we're aware of it or not? And what about that deep human need to understand consciousness, to believe that maybe there's something beyond this life, even when the evidence is so unclear and often contradictory? It's something worth pondering, that's for sure. And maybe it'll even make you want to explore the history of psychical research and all the complexities of why we believe the things we do. It's a fascinating rabbit hole to go down.
Whispers creeping through the haze, shadows dance in twisted ways, echoes hum from worlds unseen. This is where the strange convene. Step into the unknown mind, secrets hidden, twist and bind, truths that linger in between. Welcome to the spectral stream. A voice that stirs haunted tones, reality's edge becomes your home. Questions rise like fragile smoke, the uncharted realm silently